Okay, what is good, everybody? This is going to be a relatively short video. I just wanted to provide an update. I wanted to basically do a how to create your own NFT marketplace, and it became a lot more difficult than I realized, so I'm kind of getting burnt out. And so I figured, you know what, let me go ahead and just post what I have. That way, while I'm working through things, if you guys actually are interested or want to know the details, I can go into more potentially. There's just so many different pieces to take into consideration depending on how you want to actually do it, especially without smart contracts. This is obviously one of the biggest issues from a Cardano standpoint, but I did want to just talk about those myths a little bit, because even though obviously smart contracts is the end goal, there's tons of value with just being able to interact with the blockchain, which is, of course, is still decentralized, right? So I mean, just because we don't have the full smart contract doesn't mean we can still, make use of the blockchain. And if you really want to think about it, wallets, all the wallets that we're trusting, those wallets aren't fully decentralized either, right? When a wallet makes its request, it's doing that request, without, offline, if you will. If we're trusting the software, we're trusting, the code that was created in between. So, when you, like, if you look at Ada Lite, when you actually make a request, they're going to send that request back to their own node, and then that node is then going to submit that request, right? So there's obviously, there's going to be a lot of people who would argue against what I'm saying now, but it is what it is. I think that we can work with what we got, since obviously Goguen and everything is going to be 90 days plus before getting it. I figured, you know what, let's just go ahead and keep integrating and moving from there. So anyway, so what I have right now is I have a super test basic marketplace called AdaPlace that I basically did a pull from like Blockfrost API to grab the asset information, metadata information, and then just display it, right? From a most basic standpoint, that's all there is to it, right? But I guess there's just so many little wickets that I just was not prepared for in doing this, that it just kept getting longer and longer. So I'm going to just go through like the basic of how we do this. So let's just go to our diagram here. So first, let's just say, obviously, we have our little web. Oh, Jesus. Hopefully this does not go crappy. We kind of have our little dude here, and we're going to have our guy connect to a browser, which then, of course, is going to go back to our web server. Now, that's the obvious, simple construct. The moment we start to add more connections is, I guess, is when we start to get into more issues. Let's say Blockfrost or other API, and then at the same time, even though Blockfrost exists and you can maybe do queries and you can submit, say, a transaction, you still have to build that transaction, right? So you pretty much are going to have some sort of node in the back end, or some sort of service, whether it's a node or a partial or whatever, to basically formulate your transaction to either submit to Blockfrost or do on the node itself. So from the most basic standpoint, those are going to be our super simple constructs that we need. Now, that in and of itself isn't too difficult if all we're doing is, say, viewing assets. But the moment we start making these transactions, now we're adding a few layers of issues that may or may not be obvious. So for example, if I create a transaction on the node, let's say that we want to actually mint something. That mint request is going to go down to our node, but then it might not immediately be represented in Blockfrost, right? So just those types of little interactions can cause a few hiccups, right? And so you just have to think of a lot of those pieces as we go. Now, I guess I should have planned this out a little bit better, but if we want to do this, right, without a blockchain, these requests that go in, there's going to have to be some sort of service that is waiting for or handling those requests. And that's really where of course the problems come into play. So if we were just viewing data, we could literally just query Blockfrost and call it a day. Now I'm going to get into some other issues with Blockfrost from a viewing perspective in just a second, but for the most part, we can just use that API and we're good to go. But depending on how we search for metadata and how we want to make that metadata, how can you put it, more verified, if you will, querying the Blockfrost the way it is not the best. So let me just show you for a second here. So here, let's go to Blockfrost documentation. And so if you look, you can go to Blockfrost assets, right? Now, when you make a web request, this will return a list of assets. In that list, you can see over here, it's literally just your asset and the amount of the quantity of assets in this particular case. So all that's going to give us is, that there exists an asset and it has this many quantity, the mint information from a basic standpoint, right? But if we wanted to get the actual transaction information, the metadata of an asset, we can't do that through this Blockfrost API the way that it's shown. So for example, if we go down to metadata, we have the ability to query by label, but not by asset. So this is potentially one reason why, for example, the metadata standard, they're trying to push for one standard label to make it easier. But to me, that's just, it's more of a relic of the API that we currently have available. And it's not necessarily the best way, in my opinion. This is basically just querying tables with very, very minimal relationships going. So anyway, so that's going to be another issue that we'd have to address if we really want to have a marketplace where you want to be able to query assets in a reasonable fashion and then also get information back from a metadata standard without worrying about, it has to be the 721 label or whatever. But it can be done, and it's not that hard. It's just you need an API that has more in-depth relations or queries available, which you'd have to potentially create yourself or make use of someone who's already created it. But yeah, so hopefully that kind of makes sense. So those are kind of our two main issues that we'd have to tackle to have a marketplace So one is we'd have to have some sort of, and I'll just put another box here, but I'll call it a listening service. And then if you basically have Blockfrost, you're going to need to have some other API along with Blockfrost to do metadata lookups. Is essentially what ends up happening. Now that's obviously a lot of overhead, so I would recommend just potentially doing all of it from an API that can work, but Blockfrost does make everything else very easy, so it all depends on how you want to do it. But that's kind of what we end up having to have. So just for our ability to browse reasonably, and then the listening service for the ability to actually make transactions. Now, there's a few different ways that this can be done. I personally don't like see, I drew this arrow down for minting, but personally I don't like the push from a web server, because that's kind of indicating that an actor that has access to the web server can initiate a request, and the web server is going to then initiate a request or an event to a potentially secure node of some sort, right? So I'm not a security expert in this field, but at the end of the day, I think that most people would generally agree that if you're strictly thinking about security, sometimes doing a pull instead of a push, or allowing people to, it's almost like if you have a home network, would you allow anyone in your home network to query your server, or would you rather you initiate the queries to Google or wherever else, right? So that's the kind of the construct. So but in doing that, then we just have to add to our list of issues a few different things. So just by having that, now we need maybe, let's say, REST API, or let's just say, we'll just call it API, because it doesn't have to be REST, but your web server is going to have some sort of API that can now basically be available for your listening service to poll. So if an actor creates a mint request, that mint request is going to basically get saved, stored on your web server in maybe a database or something that can then store the various information that you want. So database, and then that database or the API is going to basically do queries on that database to obtain status information, priority information, and whatnot. And then that ends up being kind of the most simple construct that I can think of to get that done, to get this whole marketplace done. So what we end up having is a user can make a request to the web server stores that request in a database, makes it available via some sort of API. The listening service does some sort of polling interval to query that API to get requests. When the requests come up valid, it sends that information. The listening service gets that information and then spawns the transactions, basically. And then when the transaction is complete, sends a message back to the web server to update the database, which then can go actually back to the user via either their like some sort of JavaScript or refresh interval or something like that. And that's kind of how that would go. Obviously my arrows and stuff aren't very great, but hopefully you kind of get the gist. And then from a viewing perspective, this metadata lookup, if you don't have your own service, if you if there's no service available, which I don't know of any available, since Blockfrost is the only one that I can think of, you end up having to have a DB sync node that's connected to your Cardano node, which basically then connects to a database. Postgres is what currently is kind of like the default for Cardano. And basically then that ends up updating potentially your own metadata service ultimately, if we want to go that route, is kind of what ends up happening. Hopefully this is making sense. So the biggest issue, I guess, is with this whole metadata construct is, if this is the way, you know, someone's going to do something, we have to consider that this all takes time. And that's kind of what I was trying to allude to earlier. So we already know that blockchains aren't the fastest, most instantaneous things in the world. So we have, let's say, 20-second blocks. And so when a transaction gets requested, we're already potentially 20 seconds behind, right? And then this listening service, if this polling interval, and again, this isn't the most user-friendly, it's just more of the secure way. So if we really wanted to, we could do, more of an event base and have the web server actually send information on events and whatnot. You can do that securely. It's just not what I'm doing. But you can do that way. That way it would at least limit some time. But let's say you're still doing this polling method. Well, we have the 20 seconds for a block. We have the listening service, polling time frame. And then when that finally does trigger things, then it has to push to the DB sync. This DB sync could be a few more seconds behind, up to the Postgres, to your metadata, and then back to this. So that process is not going to necessarily be instantaneous. So that all was going to take, this part for sure is going to take a little more time. So you'd have to account for that either through when you put these requests in, and this is what I think of some of these other groups are doing. They're, you submit your email address, and that way they just, it takes its own time, and then they have it sent back to you via email so that you don't have to wait on the browser. And then others will just have you leave the browser window open and stuff like that. So that's the most basic construct. Now, we didn't even get into like user logins and stuff like that, because this is all more public. Basically, when you put in a remit request, you're not storing any special private information. What ends up happening, I guess I didn't say, is because there's no smart contract, you end up having to, quote, trust this process. So the user is going to have to trust you, me, whoever ends up being that back end process, the same way you would trust sending your money to some random website, right, is what it ends up being, where there's not that nice smart contract trust. But again, that depending on how the smart contracts are built, or depending on your wallet even, we always have that, there's a layer of trust that's saying, hey, you're doing something, it's sending something on your behalf. So I think that, obviously being open source and stuff like that is kind of the best paths on some of this, but I'd love to hear from some of you all who are more versed on blockchain and how truly different or important the regular businesses who aren't currently using blockchain can gain trust, and how we trust them, and how why is it necessarily different with blockchain? It doesn't necessarily have to be, right? If you build yourself a established business, if it's doing services in other areas that are just regular cash fiat services, why does it matter if, there's still that layer of trust a little bit in the meantime, until we get to that place where we ultimately want to be in a fully decentralized way. But anyway, that's just me. So anyway, so to do that, the user is just going to send, when they see the mint request is going to say, hey, send, to ADA or whatever it ends up being. And they send the money to the web, the address according to what the server says. And this listening service will then wait for that request to come in. When that request comes in, who was it sent from? What I noticed in here, let me, they're done. I was going to go to what was that? There's been several NFT launches, obviously, over the last few weeks. And what they all seem to be doing is you go to their site and they basically, give you a random ADA amount. And so that random ADA amount kind of ends up being your ticket, if you will. So I'm assuming that they're listening in the back end for that random ADA amount. When that triggers, they know it's from you, and then they go ahead and just, send that information back, or that back to the receiving, the sender address. Now, I think that, again, from a trust perspective, you'd have to just end up trusting the centralized service, but at least a little bit, something that could add a little bit to me is you just say, hey, here's where I'm sending it from. So you enter your customer address here. Let me kind of show. So like you'd say, hey, this is my return wallet address, so that at least along with the the randomized ADA, you can also be somewhat sure that, hey, if you put in that address, you're only that's where the money's coming from, is that address. That way you can, have some level of verification that we can have some level of verification that it's coming from that user. Now, again, that's all tricks, if you will, to try and make sure that we have who we say we are, and if there was a hacker and stuff like that, it's only going to go back to the person who actually sent money. So with that, it kind of would matter a little less if there was a hacker, because at the end of the day, we've been, it's been nice that we haven't had a lot of big hackers in this space. Thankfully, I think a lot of them probably are more supportive of our causes, I hope. But unfortunately, things like the way that our launches have been going, if the value of the asset was significant enough, well, then we could just do a attack where we just spend a whole bunch of different ADA. If they're using a automated service, which I'm assuming that they are, but if they were using an automated service, we could do an attack that basically just sent them a whole bunch of different ADA amounts to try and receive that this particular asset that in question. And again, that's not knowing fully how they're identifying you as a buyer. I just can't think of any other way that they'd be able to do that. So if anybody does know, please let me know. I'd love to understand exactly how they're doing it. But from what I can tell, when you have the opportunity to buy, the only thing that identifies you is that amount of ADA. And I have checked that does definitely change, randomly based off of every time you go in. So, there might be some IP checks and stuff like that, but at the end of the day, that's somewhat insignificant to get around, I think, for a hacker if they really wanted to, or for somebody who just had enough money to say, what, if this is $1,000 item, well, I can easily send 500 different, or I guess it would have to be, what would that be, 5,000? I don't know. But I guess the numbers is like there's 200,000 possibilities, so you would end up having to spend, say 200,000 times 200,000 Loveless, which would end up being what, like $200? Is that 200 ADA, or is that 2,000 ADA? I don't know, whatever. But you get the picture. So the higher the value, if the value is more than a few $1,000s, it's going to start to actually be lucrative to cheat. So anyway, that's it. That's all I got. That's how the most basic breakdown of how things go. Oh, I did want to really quickly, I talked about the whole 721 stuff, and what I did also want to emphasize that I've noticed people doing for metadata is they don't realize that in metadata, so here, this is one that I created, and then this is like some Cardacity group apparently is going to be out here making stuff. But in the metadata, something that we can actually query from the database is when the minting policy was closed. So I think that that's a major misconception that I've seen throughout our community. There seems to be the belief that you have to submit your minting policy, or otherwise nobody will be able to tell when your tokens expire, and that's actually not true. It is actually part of the database. If you look into here, let me see if I can just pull it up to show everyone here. Let's do Cardano. Let's do, what's the best way to do this? DB sync maybe. Let's see. DB schema maybe. So that's a major misconception. Basically, there's a before date and an after date that gets stored in the database in the blockchain. So there's no reason for us to go around. Oh, this is the actual schema. You know what? It's probably the GraphQL. Let's do. API documentation. So yeah, so we can actually get the actual. Oh, here we go. Before. There we go. Yeah, so right here, there's an invalid before, invalid hereafter in your transaction table. So there's no reason for us to go and try and post into our metadata the actual policy. The information that we need is this information. Is there an invalid before date or is there an invalid after date? And that will tell you whether the policy is expired or not, and whether people can still mint tokens or not. But yeah, so that's the gist. Let me know if you have any basic questions. Like I said, I can go in further detail. This is not my picture, by the way. I just stole it from somebody who was doing stuff on the testnet. So actually here, let me see if I can AdaZoo. I can't remember where I got it from, so AdaZoo people, I apologize, but please check these people out. There's a lot of marketplaces, Token.io. There's lots of different NFT projects that have been spawning out. I'm wanting to be able to just kind of peruse, like if we literally here, let me just go through a few. Here, let me close this too. Let's just go to page 200. Let's just see what randomly will pop up here. A bunch of stuff. But yeah, people have been constantly posting. I have this connected to the mainnet as well, but I won't go there just yet. But test tilde. So yeah, so there's like people who are just creating a whole bunch of nonsense on these things, of course, as well. So who knows what this is. But yeah, so the point is, you guys can definitely do it. It's not super difficult. It has been a pain, and the things that have been a pain for me is just just this having a listening service, a database, and doing it in a way that I would like to be modularized. Like, so my goal is to have this as a module that I can post open source and then allow people to just install it, and then that way they have access as long as they subscribe to Blockfrost or whatever other API. Then that can at least give them this ability to browse people's browse all the NFTs that are getting created. That's what I'd like to do. This listening service side, I think, is kludgy for me, and honestly, I don't know if this is going to be OBE by the time, how important is this? How much are people going to actually want this ability? Are people chomping at the bit to be able to sell like ASAP? I don't know. If they were, I would have expected there to be a whole bunch of marketplaces already, but I think a lot of people are just saying wait for the smart contracts, because one of the big pieces that we can't do is the whole royalty construct. At least we can't do it on blockchain. And so you create a whole bunch of assets right now. Can you add them to a smart contract later, or put in some sort of construct where you submit it back to the smart contract and it will give you, royalties, or, do something like that? You can do that, and potentially, but once an asset is sold, unless you provide some sort of incentive for that user to submit it back to the smart contract, it's gone, right? It's theirs, and you can't really take it back or do anything to it. You can now mic smart contracts so that they can make use of things, and then maybe give them incentives to do things with your token, and then that can put it back into your own mix of allowing royalties and stuff like that. But I think that's a major piece that people are probably waiting for. So anyway, that's all I got for now. So yeah, let me know if you have any questions. Hopefully that was actually useful. I honestly don't know, but if it's not, I'm sure you guys will thumbs down it, and I'll be able to learn and see what we got. All right, well, you guys take care.